you have within your capacity the tools to do so much for yourself with such simple things as sitting and being aware of your body, smiling, standing on the ground and just feeling the earth beneath your feet and realizing that you are being supported in that way. Come back into that present moment and really enjoy it. There's so much available to us when we become present with our body and present with our surroundings.
Welcome to the Medical Trauma Support Podcast, the show where we shine a light on the hidden impacts of medical trauma, explore tools for healing, and empower you to take control of your health journey. I'm Sarah, your host, a passionate advocate for trauma-informed care, somatic healing, and compassionate conversations. I'll bring you expert insights, healing strategies, and personal stories of resilience to help you feel seen, heard, and supported on your path to recovery. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Medical Trauma Support Podcast. And I am very excited today to have Devon Hornby, who is the owner of Tao Health Clinic in Austin. And Devon, I describe you as magic to people, but I will say the words of what you do. Devon does manual therapy and Chinese medicine. Devon, thank you for sharing your time and being here.
I'm glad to be here.
So before we jump into you sharing, what we are going to talk about today, I want to tell people listening about my experience with you, if that's okay. So I think that I probably started seeing you in like 2013. I had a friend tell me, like, I was having some back pain, and a friend just told me, oh my gosh, well, Devon helped me. I had this chronic knee pain. You have to go see him. And what I didn't expect was that it would be so much more than helping me with my back. And I feel kind of emotional sharing this, but you were such a huge part of my deep healing process. And I think that, and this is what we'll talk about today, but when I first went to see Devon, my body was so tight that I think I had to see him first before I could really start to access what was held there and create space for it to move. And then as things did start to happen, and I really stepped into my healing journey, Devon was one of the few people, I had a very small handful of people in my life who were like my touchstones. So yeah, I feel like my experience with you, Devon, it's been like magic. You've been like a huge part of my healing journey. And I'm very thankful to you. And I am so excited for people to get to hear your wisdom, outside of being in the space with you. People who don't live in Austin and aren't able to come and see you in person. I want them to get a little bit of your wisdom.
Well, I'll see what I can come up with.
So, Devon, like what we had talked about, sharing with the people listening is about how trauma really impacts the body and how a lot of the healing from trauma, you need to support the body in that. And I'd love to hear your take on that, like how you approach that when somebody comes in to see you.
Well, I think in terms of, addressing trauma of any kind, the body becomes very important in most Asian traditions. And I think more and more in the West, we're beginning to recognize this as well. Our memories, are stored in different places, and our emotional memory is largely, it is our body. Our body is a reflection of our emotional memory. And so even how we move through the world, how we use our body is typically a reflection of our emotional experience, particularly in our youth, but through our entire life. That's what we carry with us, and so our body can act as a really profound vehicle for accessing anything that has happened to us, be it a physical trauma or emotional trauma, and give us the opportunity to process and integrate, which is a real gift. And so, that's why, you talked about coming in to see me to heal your back pain, and you said, well, you got much, much more. Well, no, we healed your back pain, and that involved more than you realized.
It involved like a lifetime. It
Yeah,
involved what,
yeah,
33 years
yeah.
of at that point.
Exactly. Yeah, there was a little bit more to it than you realized.
Yes.
Definitely. And I mean, that's often the case, and people are very often surprised by what comes up, by simply having work done on their neck or their shoulders or whatever. I mean, wherever they're holding stuff. And to think that you're providing any kind of healing and you're not addressing those things is really is kind of dishonest, because you can
Hmm.
certainly, you can make somebody feel better, but it's like giving somebody a painkiller or a muscle relaxant. You're not really addressing the problem, you're just alleviating the symptoms.
Yes. Yeah, I think about my own experience walking into your space in your office, and I lay on your what is that called? Like the bed, like it looks like the bed you would lay on for a
Yeah, a massage table.
massage table.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I lay there, and you are outside, you're prepping to come in, and as I'm laying there, my body's already doing things. It's like I walk into that space and my body knows, okay, this is the safe space. So I'm curious. I mean, that's got to happen to everybody else who comes in, right?
Well, I think to varying degrees. I mean, yes, I think it happens. Something like that happens to everybody. Whether they notice or not is another thing. And
Hmm.
some people coming into that space and having the experience you had, that will actually come across as making them remarkably uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Some people, I think, we have an inherent wisdom, and we know what we're capable of processing, what we're capable of digesting. And
Hmm.
sometimes our bodies, they're like, oh, not quite ready for this. Can you just make my ankle stop hurting?
Yeah.
And leave it at that, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but we do need to recognize that that's, it's a stopgap measure. It's not getting to the root of what's going on.
Hmm. And I think too about how you've often told me, like somebody's foot may hurt, but it's actually there's something going on in their shoulder.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's true. The body's a complex weave, just even in its physicality. Very often you will find that most of the problems that you find on the body relate back to something that's going on in the torso. And then
Hmm.
in Asian medicine, we have a very clear map of what the torso represents in terms of emotional components, right? So where grief is, where anger is, where fear is, they all have, standard places they hang out. And that's, it's not set in stone, but it's certainly a really good place to begin the work. If that's the kind of work you want to do, that's
Hmm.
really good. And I'll mention to people, working through their chest. And I'm like, well, we tend to hold a lot of grief here. And
Hmm.
I mean, hundreds of people at this point, I just say that and they just start to cry, right?
Hmm.
Because it's like giving them permission. It's like, yes, what you're feeling right now, that's normal and it's good and it's healthy.
Hmm. Wow. So you often find that grief is showing up here in the upper chest.
Yes. Yeah.
Where do you find, because you mentioned grief, fear, and anger, and
Yeah.
those three things come up so much in medical trauma.
Yes.
So where do you tend to find fear and anger?
Well, yeah, I use those because they delineate the three main sections of the torso. So, grief being the upper section, anger being the midsection, and fear being in the lower, much deeper. Like that's where you're getting down into the hip flexors and the
Mm,
difficult to reach muscles, the ones that are very protected, and not ironically, are surrounded by a lot of stuff.
yeah.
There's a lot in between you and that, and to access it safely requires a certain amount of respect and patience
Hmm.
and care. Otherwise, things can get they can be too much for somebody.
Hmm. I love that. And I think that's one of the many reasons that I see you is that I feel safe when I go to see you because you have that respect for the importance to take things slowly and gently and listen to the body. Like I can tell in my experience with you that you're like having a conversation with the body. It feels like to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, that's it's absolutely necessary. The body has so many layers of protection. If you don't show it the respect and the care, it will shut you out.
Hmm.
And I mean, you still, that's not to say that you don't get to, air quotes, achieve something, right?
Hmm.
But what you're achieving is very superficial. And, if you have somebody who has chronic pain and that's the approach you take, you've got a lifetime client because they're going to be coming back all the time to get the same thing treated over and over and over again because you're not really addressing it. You're just making the symptoms go away.
Hmm.
Body work works like any form of medicine. It's very easy to take that route. But for true healing to occur, you're going to need to get in there, and that requires, yeah, a level of care. I guess
Hmm.
is
And
yeah.
like trust and safety.
Yes,
And I think about that so much. I think about, I think about medical trauma a lot,
right,
obviously.
yeah,
Um, and I think about how can people heal? How can people start that process of healing? And I just think safety is really the first step, is finding just the tiniest bit of safety to start to step into the work. And it's what we're talking about, is letting somebody find some safety and some trust with you before you go deeper, listening to the body, letting the body guide you, like, oh, it's ready to go, maybe like a layer deeper.
right, yeah, and that sometimes that requires just waiting. There's a lot
Hmm.
to be said for even on the practitioner's part, how we regard how we regard what we're addressing, how we regard the individual, having respect for the individual and their journey and where they are.
Hmm.
I was working with a healing arts practitioner recently, very very talented woman, and she said that we need to recognize that every person who lies down on our table is the hero of an epic.
Hmm.
They've had their journey to get here, and it's a heroic one. Every one of us has a story, right? And to have that respect is really important. And another thing that I've learned that I think is really critical to this is the idea that to respect the injury itself.
Hmm.
I mean injury. Even using that term, our terminology is can be problematic. The words like injury and even trauma. What's
Hmm.
trauma? Trauma is an adaptation. It adapted to something that happened,
Hmm.
right? And that adaptation at the time was the best that our body had to offer.
Right.
And similarly, and a so-called injury is very often what that is an adaptation. And as we understand chronic pain more and more, we actually realize that's really true. For a
Hmm.
long time, people thought chronic pain was the result of acute pain that persisted, and it turns out that chronic pain is actually the result of our reaction to acute pain.
Hmm.
It's how we adapted, and it's those adaptations that at the time served us. They allowed us to function in the world, but at a certain
Hmm.
point we need to be able to learn to put them down. And that's, I mean, that
Yes.
applies to many things. And I mean, trauma, medical trauma is a particularly good example of that. Medical intervention is very often necessary, maybe not quite as much as it's used, but still it is necessary, and it does things to the body that are inherently traumatic,
Hmm.
right? And leave the body in a very disorganized state. And the
Hmm.
body does the best it can to put those pieces back together again.
Yeah, but sometimes it needs a little bit of extra help.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and we need to integrate, and that the integration I think is the critical thing. It's all of these adaptations that we have. They're great. They're tools, and they may even come in handy again. We don't need to
Hmm.
dispose of them, but they need to be put into the larger picture of who we are.
Yes, and I think I love the word adaptations. It makes me also think of the word like coping. I think a lot of people use the phrase
Yeah,
like coping.
yeah,
And yeah, I think there is like a really beautiful way to shift your perception, because we tend to be like, oh, somebody who may be using alcohol or another substance to cope, instead of thinking, oh, this is bad, to think this is a coping strategy, or this is an adaptation that is helping them in this moment keep going.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of drug users or alcohol users will tell you if you really dig, if they're really working in their process, they'll realize that that addiction that they had, that's why they're alive,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
It saw them through a part of their life that they would have not survived otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think for anyone listening to hear that and maybe give themselves grace to if there are things that they've been kind of hard on themselves about, but to start to look at it as like, well, thank God I
Yeah.
had that coping strategy because that has gotten me to where I am now. And maybe to recognize I think I'm ready to get some new strategies. But to know that you have this, and I think there's like comfort too, even as people go through their journey, their healing journey, and find these like coping strategies that feel more nourishing and feel better to them. There's some comfort in knowing that this other
Right.
coping is still there, the thing
Yeah.
that got them through in the hardest times, and to know that that's okay. And it's actually, I think, beautiful that we have like this range of ways to cope
Yeah.
or adapt to changes in our lives. And um, I was curious because I know that you're very experienced in this area, and I was curious about clients you've worked with that have been coming back from maybe a traumatic medical experience or um, chronic pain. I know that you must see a lot of people with
Yeah.
chronic
Yeah.
pain,
Mhm.
and also like chronic illness.
Yeah.
So I was curious some of the ways that you help people who are coming in with those issues.
Well, yeah, I mean, people who are coming in with chronic pain, and particularly people who are coming in with chronic pain associated with, for example, a surgery,
Mhm.
right? It's, I mean, it's a very complicated situation, and one where there isn't some kind of, I can't come out and say, well, this is what you do, right?
Mm.
The what you do, the do there is to be curious. What's going on? What do
Mhm.
you feel? What don't you feel?
Mhm.
Right, and to look beyond, and probably the most important thing, for anybody who does any kind of form of manual therapy, look beyond where it hurts. Because as you know very well, where it hurts and where the problem is, they're rarely in the same place.
Mhm.
And I mean that's the same in any kind of trauma, right? The trigger, what we see. Oh, I freaked out because this happened. Somebody touched me here or something like that. Well, why are you protecting that? What's there
Mhm.
that's causing you to react in that way? And there's wisdom. There's a tremendous amount of wisdom to be found in that,
Mhm.
learning about ourselves. And even the simple act of, like if somebody comes in low back pain, right, and their hip flexors are
Mhm.
really tight, you don't just go and you grind away at those hip flexors. Like, I mean, that's so wrong from so many different perspectives. Not, not just dangerous, but instead to touch it deeply, and introduce the discomfort that's there, but let
Mhm.
the body respond to that. Right? It's like,
Mhm.
hey, did you know you're doing this?
Mhm.
Have you seen this? Have you felt this? Because very often those kind of things, we're dissociated from them.
Mhm.
And so to just bring that person's awareness, the softening that can happen, I mean, the low back, it requires more time, more patience, but it's amazing, with somebody, you'll see this, you just put your hand on somebody's shoulder, right? And you'll feel the shoulder drop
Mhm.
because you brought their awareness to
Mhm.
that place. And that's very profound. And, in terms of the Asian traditions, that bringing awareness, that openness through that's where healing occurs, right? Then
Mhm.
the energy begins to move there, and then integration happens. It becomes part of the whole again. We walk around, medical trauma or not, most people are walking around as disparate parts.
Mhm.
There's very little integrity. If you watch the way people walk, it's like a pair of legs carrying around a sack of potatoes,
Mhm.
right? We've got a long way to go in terms of coming back into our bodies,
Mhm.
and we've got very good reason not to be there. I mean, we have to come back to that.
Yeah.
It's so important to recognize. It's not that there's something wrong with us. It's in fact, it's a very important adaptation.
Yes.
to be able to dissociate like that, because there's so much there's so much suffering, there's so much pain, and there's so much pressure societally and otherwise on us,
Hmm.
that we need a safe place, and our bodies aren't typically a safe place.
I think especially medical trauma is an
Yeah,
experience where people are like, okay, my body is not safe anymore. And I think that the way that I view it is we have to help people slowly build capacity to be with those parts that they have disconnected from.
yes,
Because like you said, if someone were to come in and you were to like grind away at getting back into this part, that can be like traumatizing.
yes, yeah,
Yeah, and so to build slowly and gently build that capacity, and there are different ways that people do that. There's, nervous system practices that can help build capacity, but also I think in my experience with you is like each time you go back and you feel safer each time and you trust, you're also building capacity gently to be with that part in like a deeper way.
yeah. That's a very articulate way of describing it. That's
Yeah.
exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
Reintegration.
And you know what I also realized, Devin, is that we've been talking about manual therapy, and I think probably the majority of the population does not know what manual therapy is. So, will you tell people
Step
what
back
that
for a minute.
means?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, manual therapy is an increasingly popular phrase to describe anyone who's using their hands to affect change on the body. And
Hmm.
so technically it's a very broad sweeping term. And so massage therapy is a form of manual therapy, even chiropractic is a form of manual therapy. And so some of us have adopted that term. Some, physical therapists use it very specifically. They're basically a physical therapist who practices and I've, what's the right word? A very focused form of massage therapy.
Hmm.
And others, myself included, what we're doing is that we're allowing ourselves space. So I'm bringing shiatsu and traditional Chinese massage and Western myofascial techniques and all of these different things together. And so then rather than giving this long list of all these different things, I'm telling you, well, I use my hands and I do therapeutic work in that way.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think even manual therapy, that phrase doesn't encompass the experience of working with you. And of course, different people are going to do manual therapy differently, but just the way you approach it is so it feels so much bigger, but it just makes me think about the body is where the wisdom is.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, it's hard for me to totally put it into words, the experience that I've had with you and with manual therapy.
I mean, it's hard to describe in part because of what you were just saying, is that the wisdom is in our bodies. As
Hmm.
soon as we move to conceptualizing, as soon as we bring it to mind, what we think of as mind, which is interesting in and of itself. What we think of mind being in our head, whereas in Asian traditions, the mind is actually centered in the heart.
Mm.
Um, and our language fails us, particularly Western languages, because we don't think that way. We
Hmm.
don't think of the mind being in our body, and that what is actually located in our head is just it's our sense perceptions and our intellectual capacities.
Hmm.
But so much of our wisdom, so much of what we know, right, is actually occurring somewhere else,
Hmm.
right? And so when you try to describe the experience of manual therapy, or as a teacher of manual therapy, to even trying to describe some of the things that we're doing,
Hmm.
right? You have to be, it's like this, and you demonstrate it, because words aren't going to do it.
Yeah, that's my experience. And even as I was preparing for us to talk today, it was hard. Like the words don't pick up the impact that this has had on my life.
Right.
And I feel like there was something when I talked to you and asked if you'd be on this podcast, I was excited for many reasons, but one was that I feel like every single time I come to see you, I leave with this like nugget of wisdom. And it comes up just like in our conversation and just like what is happening, but it's like this like profound little piece of wisdom that I then like kind of like tuck in and incorporate it into like the way I see the world
Right.
and everything. Yeah, it has been like very profound, and so I'm so happy for other people to be able to hear you sharing this. And then one other thing too that's coming up is you talked about the myofascial work.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that
Well,
and
I
like
mean,
what that is. What does that
okay.
mean?
Yeah. So myofascial work is working with the connective tissues of the body.
Mhm.
One of the things that we tend not to really, when we think of massage, when we think of relaxing, we're thinking about the muscles, right? And
Mhm.
our muscles, that they contract and they relax. And so we think, well, if my muscle relaxes, then everything's going to be fine. But that's not really the case, because the muscle, like even in the depths of the muscle, it's made up more of connective tissue than it is what we would call muscle fiber.
Mhm.
And so, what that muscle does is being determined almost entirely by the constraints being brought upon it by connective tissue, by fascia. The
Mhm.
myofascial work is beginning to address the fascia of the muscle and the fascia of the body to free it up, to change the ranges of motion and the relationships in the body in such a way that's more advantageous for the individual.
Mhm. And and as you're talking about that, I think in my experience, um, as we start to shift like the fascia, the connective tissue, and the muscles can shift, there is this, it makes space for us emotionally.
Yes. Yeah. As we were talking about, that our emotions are stored in our body.
Mhm.
Switching back over to the Asian view, which is much easier, it's much more familiar territory for me.
Mhm.
The fascia is the medium in which our emotional memory is embedded,
Mm.
right? And so, whatever memories we carry in our body, whatever habits we carry in our body, are actually what that is connective tissue relationships.
Mm.
And so you can see this, like there's I always think there's this classic study, and I wish I could cite it better, but in the 1970s, one of the colleges on the West Coast paid a bunch of students to come in to just sit in a room and smile.
Mhm.
Right? That's it. They just paid you to sit there for 5 minutes smiling, and they did a personality score before and one afterwards, and they did a similar group of frowning. Okay. And the smiling group, of course, nobody's surprised to know that they did fantastically better. Like their whole mood changed just from the act of smiling. They didn't have a reason to smile. The
Mhm.
fact that their body was doing something that reflected happiness, their mind and everything else came into alignment with it.
Mhm.
And so one of the funniest parts that I remember about this study, that because I was reading about somebody who wrote about it years later, and the guy, one of the people who did this study, would get letters from participants, and the people who were paid to frown were still writing to him 10 and 15 years later, telling him what a horrible thing that was that he did, and couldn't believe that he was wasting his money doing this, and like just all of this negativity. And the smiling group was still writing him, telling him how fantastic it was and how much they learned and how it had actually changed their lives.
Wow.
And it was one, just sitting there for 5 minutes smiling. And people were like, oh, wait, I can choose.
Right.
I can choose. And the thing is that with the connective tissues, it predisposes us like in our facial expressions. We're predisposed. Are we smiling? Are we frowning? That
Mhm.
feedback loop comes into our mind and it tells us, I'm sad. I'm happy,
Mhm.
right? It works both ways. And this, being as informed as you are, I'm sure you understand how this fits into the concept of the social nervous system, right?
Mhm.
In
Mhm.
polyvagal theory, like we actually understand anatomically, physiologically how that's happening,
Mhm.
right? That whole feedback loop it's wired into us, and
Yes.
slouched shoulders and the hunched forward and all the things that we do that tell us about our condition. And what we don't
Mhm.
realize is that those things they're completely under our control. We can pull our shoulders back and we can raise our head up and feel more enlivened. We can feel more present and all of these things. We can train our bodies, and
Mhm.
we are training our bodies all the time, and we don't recognize it. And so consequently, we're not very careful about what we're training our bodies for. And so instead,
Mm-hmm.
we're sitting in front of our computer and we've got our head buried in it and our heads drop forward. And that's a sign of feeling oppressed. That's a sign of fear. It's a sign of anxiety and depression, all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And our body sends that signal. And then in our minds, we're like, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm all of these
Mm-hmm.
things. Um,
That's a
fear,
vicious cycle,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
your body's telling your mind that, then your mind starts saying it and it's telling your body, and you
right,
just
right.
get more and
Yeah,
more into that. But to me, that's a beautiful message for
yeah,
people listening to this. God, what like a sense of agency
yeah. It's so
we
empowering.
have.
So empowering. Yeah.
Yes. So if you're listening, set a 1 minute timer, 5 minute timer,
Exactly.
smile,
Smile and
pull
sit
your
up straight. Yeah.
exactly, pull your shoulders back, that feels good. I found myself, I'm kind of like hunching in, looking at you as we
Yes,
talk.
the computer,
Um,
yes, our evil little friend.
yes, yes. And we wonder why the rates of anxiety and depression are so high. We're going further and further into the constant use of computers and cell phones versus opening up, looking at the horizon, looking in the face of people that we love, and talking
Mhm.
about the social connection, right? Turning. This is a big part of that social connection, is
Yes, yes.
turning and seeing and connecting. And when you're staring at a screen, you're not doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right in front of you, the straight eyes here.
And
Whereas social connection is not that. It is moving, it is turning, engaging.
yes, and it's not that one of those is wrong and the other is right. Right? The narrow focus that we can use to accomplish tasks is phenomenal. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the human capacity for focus is unbelievable, and what we can
Mm-hmm.
accomplish when we do it. Look, we're talking on computers.
Right.
Like, think of what we've done. But
Yes.
we our current social milieu has created where it favors narrow focus so much
Mm-hmm.
that many people don't move into open focus,
Mm-hmm.
right? They don't, and it's a real challenge. It's something,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not that they're crippled, it's that they're untrained. It's a skill that they haven't worked,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to just get somebody to have open focus, particularly, yes, into your environment is fantastic, but as a body worker, as somebody who works with the body so much, to bring that open focus into your body. Feel your toes. Feel your toes
Mm-hmm.
touching your toes. Feel the
Mm-hmm.
socks on your feet. Go through and just feel all that stuff and feel the difference that it makes after you've done. Go through your body, feel the clothing on all these different things. Move your way through your body, and then just sit there
Mm-hmm.
for a while afterwards and realize how different that is to the narrow focus of whatever's in front of me is the only important thing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I, I'm a I read a book recently, which I think it's actually, I'm using his terminology of open and closed focus or narrow focus. Les Femi wrote a book called The Open Focus Brain.
Mm.
It's absolutely brilliant, and something that people, particularly people who are working with trauma, should really consider looking at, because he gives really profound, simple tools of awareness to work with our pain, be it emotional or physical, in a
Mm.
way that is integrative and yeah, well, it's integrative. It doesn't pathologize, right? This isn't, we have such a tendency, right, to be like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so like now that we talk about narrow and open focus, well, narrow focus is bad, open focus is good. Well, yeah, I'm tell you what, you don't want me driving with open focus.
Right.
That's not going to end well.
Yeah.
I mean, so there are just there's a time and place for everything, and it's wonderful when we learn to be able to navigate through those things
Mm-hmm.
smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's amazing. I this has been wonderful. I knew this conversation would be so enjoyable for me, and I hope, a lot of people are able to listen and gather some of this wisdom. And but before we wrap up, I wanted to see if there's anything else that you felt like you really wanted listeners to know, or if you have something coming up, because I know you have done meditation workshops. Um, Really anything that you think would be valuable for the listeners to hear.
Yeah, I don't have anything coming up at the moment. Just a lot of transition going on. And I'm not sure that I would say that I have something else I want to say so much as just to reiterate. I think the most important thing that we touched upon, and the thing I want people to understand so, so importantly, is how empowering this information is. You
Mm-hmm.
have within your capacity the tools to do so much for yourself with such simple things as sitting and being aware of your body, smiling, standing on the ground and just feeling the earth beneath your feet and realizing that you're being supported in that way, right? Come back into that present moment and really enjoy it. There's so much available to us when we become present with our
Mm-hmm.
body and present with our surroundings, right? We're trapped often. We can't change because we're not here.
Right.
And so just come to now. And as uncomfortable as that may be, that's the place, that's where change happens.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think that's such a beautiful offering to end with. So, anyone listening, you can take the next minute to whatever, however much time you have to try to be here right now and to do the practice that Devon talked about, feeling your toes touching each other, working your way up the body or starting at your head and working your way down. And if the body is a place that doesn't feel safe, maybe start with a pinky finger.
Exactly.
Just start with, what does that feel like? Just being in that for a short period of time and taking your time and slowly building up the capacity to maybe then feel a second finger. Um, yeah, because we're all starting from a different place and there's no bad place to start.
Right.
All right.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Devon, for being
Thank you.
here.
I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, this
It's an
was
honor.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Medical Trauma Support Podcast. If you are looking for some tips to soothe your own nervous system, you can go to my website and find a free guide to doing that. The website is medicaltraumasupport.com.